Doris Gorman.
Hi.
Guys.
Hello.
So they were both born and raised in Detroit, and we're kind of gonna focus. We'll focus on my grandpa's story, and we'll just have my grandma chime in because they grew up in the same neighborhood and know the same people. But the main focus is on my grandpa. So, Grandpa, where exactly were you born?
I was born in Detroit on 15th Street in Corktown, just below Porter, or excuse me, just below Bagley Avenue. And I lived there for approximately 2 years or so, 3 years. And then we moved to West Lafayette, still in the immediate area, southwest Detroit. And I lived in Lafayette for another 2 years or so, and then we moved. It was at a time where the folks were always looking around for a better price on rentals. We didn't own a house; we rented, and moved on Porter Street between 22nd and 23rd Street, just at the foot of the Ambassador Bridge.
Okay, so
And
let me interrupt you.
yes,
So your parents rented all three of those houses, correct?
correct.
Okay,
Yes,
and
yes, they did.
they moved around just to find better pricing.
That's it.
Okay.
That's it. And plus, I shouldn't say it that way because my other family, my grandmother and grandfather lived right around the corner on 23rd Street. My uncles, they lived just down the street on 23rd Street. So it was kind of the same areas where my family got together.
Okay. So that area is now Mexican Town, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
It
so
is.
that is where you grew up for the most part, right?
I did.
Right. And what was the racial makeup like in that neighborhood?
Well, primarily it was it was kind of hard to think about it at the time, but there were a number of, if there was a race difference, it would be there were more Mexican families around than black families. There weren't that many, but there was a lot. We grew up with a lot of Mexican folks, and when I was 12 years old, I was on a baseball team, and they took a picture of the whole baseball team, and loved these guys. Just knew them all my life and everything. We were in the park, took this picture of it, and then looked at the picture, and I found that there were 3 white guys and 8 Mexicans and 1 black on the team. So I never realized there were that many Mexicans
That
in the
didn't mean
area.
a thing.
Yeah.
It was normal.
It was just our friends.
So you wouldn't say that there was any like racism going on with the
Well,
Hispanic families and the blacks, or what?
No, nothing like that. There was nothing, never any problem of any sort. But in the early 40s, when I was, I don't know, 5 or 6, no, probably 6 or 7, there was a race riot in the city of Detroit. And I know that my mom and dad and my sister especially, she's 10 years older, 11 years older than me, keep me in the house for fear of a race riot. Had nothing to do with the west side of Detroit. Most of it was going on the east side of Detroit. And but as far as race went, I didn't realize there was anything. I grew up right around the corner from Mr. and Mrs. Mays, Paul Mays and Pete Mays, both black folk that I played ball with and all of that sort of thing. They didn't go to school with me. I went to St. Anne's School. But they lived on 22nd, right off of 22nd Street, and there was large, like a row house type of thing that was on 22nd Street. There was 2 steps up from the sidewalk, and there was a door, and they went in, and there was about 4 or 5 of those, 2-story. And right around the corner, Mr. and Mrs. Mays lived in a house. Well, Mr. Mays, the black man, owned a flower shop. And he would be out doing his garden in the back of the house. Well, the back of the row house backed up to his yard. And he'd be out cutting the flowers or taking care of the lawn or something, always with a dress shirt on and tie. And the folks were Appalachian hillbillies. I guess the best way I can describe that. And they always looked down on Mr. and Mrs. Hayes or Mays because they were black. But that was the only time I ever really saw prejudice. And it was, I think, if there were prejudice of any sort in my area or with my family or folks, it was to do with the Southern folks who their lifestyle danced to the beat of a real different drum. And but as far as Mexican or black, we never had any problems with them at all. Now, my wife was born and raised in Detroit as well on 24th Street, just north of Verner Highway. And one of her best friends, well, I'll let her tell you that.
My next door neighbor was Angie Garcia, and we're still tight friends to this day. And when we grew up with her, there was like 8 kids, and we played with them. We played with her big brothers, baseball and football and everything, even though boys and girls together. And it was just, that was natural. There was nothing abnormal about that at all. It's just what you did.
And that was a Hispanic family, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, Grandpa, so you lived in that area of Detroit, Porter Street, right?
Yes.
Until you were 17?
Until I was, 17.
Okay, so where did you move to then and why? What was your reasoning?
And, well, they had, for one thing, there was a change. The expressway was being torn up on the east side of Detroit. And they were just tearing down a lot of the area of that were black families lived in, mostly rentals and all of that. And for the lion's share of the time I grew up, blacks were on the east side, and there weren't that many in around where we grew up. Well, they started coming over from the west side and lived on 12th Street. Well, then within the expressway were coming through, they started moving north, more north. And my family lived there, and their house was broken into 3 different times. And so my dad says, well, it's time we moved out. So we, at that point in time, moved to Finkel and Livernois area in just half a mile down from University of Detroit, in that area, northwest Detroit. And because of the distance, I was in the 12th grade at that time, and I couldn't go back to St. Anne because it was too far. They said I had to take 3 buses to go, and they wouldn't let me go. So I finished school at Cooley High School in northwest Detroit. And then it was after that I moved from that house and I went into service in 1957. I joined the Army, and so that's the next move, I guess you'd say, is when I got out of the service. I went back, lived with my folks on Globe Street in northwest Detroit, and I was going with my girlfriend at the time, who we met in school, at St. Anne in Detroit, and we decided to get married. Got married in 1959, and then moved again to Detroit, over on Clover Lawn, only further out than where we were living on Globe Street, closer to my folks' house than Dolores's. Now, Dolores, she can tell you, she moved from Detroit to where?
Garden City.
Garden City.
All right, Grandpa, let me ask you a couple of follow-up
yes.
questions. So when you first moved from Porter Street to Finkel and Livernois, so did your family blame the influx of African Americans for the breaking in? Is that what they thought was happening? They
Yes.
did. Okay.
That was it.
So there were more African Americans moving into the neighborhood, so your family felt
Correct.
it would be better to move northeast.
They moved. They had lived on 12th Street. It was a Jewish neighborhood,
Hmm.
and over in Collingwood and all of that sort of thing. And the Jewish folks were moving out, and because of the expressway being on the east side, there were the black families were moving into that area more on the west side, and that was the influx of black coming out. And like I said, our folks' house was broken into 3 different times, and it just was said, no, it's time to get out of this area. Well, then in the 60s into the we had moved. I was trying to bring in where the riots were in Detroit, but that was later on.
1967.
Yeah, that's when my folks moved.
All right, we'll get to that point. Sorry, I don't want to keep interrupting
Yeah.
you. But okay, so when you moved to Finkel and Livernois, what was the racial makeup of that neighborhood?
Mostly, it was predominantly white,
Okay.
and but again, there was still that migration coming
Hmm.
from the east side.
Okay, so then you moved to that, and then you joined the service.
Yes.
Okay, when you left the service and you came to live with your parents, they were still in northeast, but a different area of northeast, correct?
No, they still lived.
Livernois.
They still were at Livernois.
Yes.
Okay.
And it was at that time when they were having the break-ins, and they moved at that time to Wyandotte, actually.
Okay. And did you move with them to Wyandotte?
No,
Okay.
because that was just after that my wife and I were married.
Okay. So you and Grandma got married.
And we were still living in Detroit in the northwest area there. We moved to Clover Lawn,
You and Grandma.
Grandma and I.
Okay.
And
And what's a bigger street than Cloverline?
5 miles, just
5
between
miles.
5 mile and 5.5 miles, Curtin. And my sister lived still in the same area there where my mother lived, and so we were kind of close to all of them.
What was the racial makeup of that neighborhood? It was an apartment that you two lived in, correct?
Yes, we lived
Okay.
in the upper, and it was predominantly white.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So every time that your parents moved, it was because they felt that the neighborhood was declining, or
Not necessarily. It wasn't. It wasn't so much the declining of it. It was just there were better. And again, we were from a family that rented houses, and it was predominantly my father wanted to see where the best bargain was on the rental, but we weren't overwhelmed with black folks or anything like that moving into the area. Those that were in there were a really nice family, so it wasn't anything special to be moving out.
okay, interesting. Okay, so you guys lived at the apartment at 5 in Cloverfield for
Cloverline.
Clover Lawn?
It was on Clover Lawn, and that was between Livernois and Wyoming.
okay, so that's still northeast, correct?
It's still
Mhm.
northwest.
Northwest. Okay, so after 2 years there, then where did you folks move?
Well, then we bought a house in Redford.
Okay, so this was the first house that you purchased together, and you bought it.
Correct.
Okay, so
Beach Daily between 6 and 7 Mile Road.
what prompted you to leave Detroit completely? I mean, not very far, but
Well, actually, my folks lived in Wyandotte at the time, and but my sister lived near us in when we lived in Detroit on Clover Lawn, Dolores and I, and then my sister moved out of there to Redford Township. So we'd go out to Redford Township. Well, then my mom bought a place or got a place in Redford. So when Dolores and I were looking for homes, we looked out that way where the family was, I guess. And
Your
that's
brother moved there
Oh, I'm
first.
sorry. My brother moved there first.
when the houses were just being built in
Yes.
that area.
so Redford was a relatively new neighborhood at the time.
And
Yes.
6 Mile and
Yes, it
Beach
was.
Daily area, yes.
And then the house that we bought was right on Beach Daily between 6
And
and
that
7
was a
miles.
newly built home.
and it was newly built, and we bought it brand new.
So would you say that that neighborhood was again predominantly white?
Correct.
Okay.
That was, but there were black families that lived around there,
Hmm.
but sporadically.
So you never really, aside from the moving and stuff, never really noticed any super racial tensions in your areas, or
Not,
nothing that really came to a boil?
not
No.
really, not really. I was a little nervous when the riots were going on. We lived in Redford.
Yeah. So what was your guys' experience of the riots? Or
Just seeing all the military vehicles coming down Beach Daily and, fully armed and everything. But everything was going on in downtown Detroit.
I was working at Ford Motor at the time at the Wixom assembly plant out in Wixom, and we had to. I worked the afternoon shift, and we had to get out by 9 o'clock. They had to close. There was a curfew. It was 10 or 10:30 or something in the Detroit area because of the riots. Well, we made it. I had to come home at that time, and it wasn't that far, but there were, and I worked with a lot of black fellas that lived in Detroit, and one experience I'll never forget was this George Jameson. His wife was going to come and pick them up out there, him and two other fellas that worked with us, and take to Detroit, and they lived over in the well, I guess it was in, I don't know, it's a 5 Mile and Linwood area. Both of them, or all three of them. She didn't make it out there because the police wouldn't let her get through, and they walked all night long, going from the Wixom assembly plant to over there to Livernois and 8 Mile area. They walked all of that all night long, dodging the police vehicles that were, when they'd see coming, they would hide because they were automatically picking up black folks. And
so that was an African American family?
Correct.
Oh, that's
3 of them were. And it was, as Dolores said, our neighbors and I would sit out on the front lawn watching the big police army
Military.
trucks come by,
They called in
Loaded.
the
loaded with the reserve.
The National Guard.
National Guard. Yes.
And they come in, and we'd see them cruising up and down our street, but never had anything close to us at all. I know when my parents, their house where they lived was just off of Livernois, and there was a store, a great big beautiful furniture store, which is still in Detroit, not that one, but Gorman's Furniture. And that was one of the places that were burned and looted, just half a block or so, block away from where my folks lived. And it was after that that they moved and all that sort to get out of the area. But as far as we personally had any problems with the families, I didn't have any problems with it. That the black and white and everything. There was no.
And your best friend in the
tensions.
service
Yes, and when I went into the service, I met a fella that
from Inkster.
from Inkster, Michigan, and James Bradshaw, and he looked somewhat like a lineman for the Detroit Tigers. He was about 6'5", and
Detroit
Lions.
Tigers, Lions. That's how big a sports fan I am. And he would always. I had my girlfriend at the time, my fiance, her picture on my locker door. And Jimmy Bradshaw would come over and he'd grab the door and he'd start dancing with the door. And
Don't say it.
get the hell away from my girlfriend. Get out of there. Get away from it. But he and his fiance Maddie, they were invited to our wedding. And that was very good friend of mine. I had several very good friends in the service, and
working at Ford.
working at Ford, I did too. Charlie Maxwell.
All right. So, the Redford house at 6th and Beach, correct?
Yes.
So, how long did you guys live there?
11 years.
11 years. And then where did you move and why, and renting or buying, all that?
Well, we bought another place.
Okay.
My wife and I both enjoyed antiques. Well, actually, what we did was move ourselves out of our home in Redford with all of the antiques that we had. So we had to get a bigger place. And so we looked around and wanted something older to go along with our antiques. So we were looking out and found this old farmhouse, or the farmhouse that we live in now. And
7 mile between Merriman and Middlebelt.
Yes.
Which is Livonia, correct?
Which is Livonia, yes, just south of 7 Mile. And have lived there for, what? 45 years.
And it's in the house which we are
45
currently
years,
sitting,
yeah.
yes. So Livonia at the time, it was a relatively new neighborhood as well, correct?
Correct.
So, again, what was the racial makeup?
Primarily,
Predominantly
again,
white.
the best that I could see were predominantly white. There were no black families in the area. Well, we lived between Middlebelt and Merriman. If there were any families in Livonia that were black, they lived east of Middlebelt because of the high school. Clarenceville High School was on Middlebelt between 7 and 8 Mile, and there were, I won't say quite a number, but there's probably 10 to 15% of that high school that were black. Nobody paid much attention to them. They were just kids, but we had no. I know when our son went to high school at first in Stevenson High School. I don't know there might have been one or two that graduated with him, black kids, but never paid too much attention to it. For the most part, it was all white.
All right, so looking back at Redford, how would you say the neighborhood after you guys moved out kind of changed and adapted as far as the racial makeup and things like that?
Well, it changed, but not for 10 years. They still let my kids. We moved to Livonia, but our children went to Our Lady of Loretto School in Livonia at Beach Daly and 6 Mile, and we took them back when we lived in Livonia. We took them back so they could go to the school there, go to the grade school in there, and I don't know as there were any blacks.
Just because it was a Catholic school and
because
they
it was
wanted
Catholic.
to finish,
But they
the
wanted to
grade
continue to go there. And but again, the racial change didn't come for another 10, 15 years, and then it was sporadic. Now, I would say in Redford, there's possibly, 15% to 20% moving in that
I'd say
northwest.
a little more, 25%, 30%.
Yeah.
So both of you still had friends that lived in your original neighborhood, correct? And when you would go and visit throughout the years, did you know what were the changes that you noticed in that neighborhood in the Southwest?
Well, going in there weren't anything special because in the northwest section of Detroit, in the area that we lived, by and large, because of the riots and that sort of thing, most of the folks moved out of there because of the racial tensions still there.
So you saw most of your white and even Hispanic friends, would you say?
Yes, oh yes, we'd see them. We would get together as a group that all went to St. Anne's School together. But of those, some lived in Troy, some lived in Royal Oak, some lived in
Berkeley.
yeah, Berkeley. Where else did Margie live? And uh, that sort of thing. And then also downriver, like Angie, Dolores's good friend and neighbor next door, her family moved to southwest Detroit and moved out toward Lincoln Park and Ecorse and that sort.
So you would say after the riots in the '60s that most of your friends.
It was a
moved there?
yes, that was a big big motivator to get out and away.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions I have. Thank you, Grandma and Grandpa, for this
welcome.
interview.
Happy to.
Lots of good info. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.